Good afternoon. Good afternoon. It's good to see you today. I'm excited about this program, and I'm looking forward to hearing a lot of what is going to transpire today. I think that, and not to overemphasize things, but I do think that history is being made, and it's good to be on the side of good history. So, but our program today, Reconciliation and Reflection, and I'm the director here at the Delta Culture Center. My name is Kyle Miller, and just looking for this being an opportunity to just have a frank and open discussion concerning the Elaine Massacre of 1919. So with that being said, I'm going to first ask Father Brown if he would come and kind of explain how this whole thing came together.
It was about a year ago that I first met Chester Johnson when he was a guest at St. John's Episcopal Church right across the street. After our initial meeting, we, I think, quickly became friends. And whenever he was in town, we got together, and also we had opportunity to email each other. He suggested some reading materials that I found very helpful. Several months after that, I had the pleasure of meeting Sheila Walker when she was in the area with a group that's doing a documentary, and immediately felt a kinship there as well. I had asked Chester, he had graciously offered, and I accepted his offer, to come down to St. John's sometime during Lent and be a part of our Lenten programming, perhaps speak one night. And it seemed to me that the powerful message that these two wonderful folks share, it was something that needed to be broadened, that I wanted it to be available to folks across religious and racial lines. The message was too important for us just to keep to ourselves in a small setting. So I went to see Dr. Miller, and we discussed the possibility of the Cultural Center bringing in Chester, and I think I made the suggestion, and while you're at it, why don't you bring Sheila too? And that's how this came to pass, and I look forward to hearing more through the program this afternoon. Thank you, Dr. Miller.
Okay. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the mic over to Judge Bryan Miller, but before I do, we will go into the program, and Judge Bryan will share with us and kind of contextualize things. And then afterwards, Chester and Sheila will talk. And then it'll be an open platform for you to share things or ask questions and things of that nature. And so we'll ask that you step up to the mic. Some of you may say, well, hey, my voice is loud enough. You can hear me anyway. But it's not as much about the amplification as it is we're also videoing this, and this video is going to go out nationally. So we want to make sure that your comments and questions and things are properly recorded. So with that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Judge Bryan Miller.
Kyle asked me to put this in context, and I started thinking about how I would put this in context, for the program today in context, so I'll do this the best way I can. I was listening to NPR about 20 years ago, and Warren Christopher, who was the Secretary of State in the Clinton administration, was speaking. And he was talking about how all of our lives are interconnected. And he said one day, it came to his mind, this thought came to his mind one day when he was driving down a lonely highway and a car was coming towards him. And he was in his lane, the car was in its lane, and they were passing. And right before they passed each other, he looked over, and the gentleman in the other car looked over at him, and their eyes met. And they knew at that moment that they were going to survive their introduction because both of them stayed in their lane. And he made the point that every day in our lives, we're interacting with people, and we're coming in contact with people, and we're interconnecting, and we don't even realize it. And so when we start thinking about Elaine, here we are, 98 years out, and there are many stories being told. And there are many people who don't want to come to terms with what happened down in southern Phillips County 98 years ago. And it causes people to do different things. I would say to not stay in the lanes or to act up in some ways. And I'll give you one example. First, let me say this. A few years ago, I was contacted by David Phillips Solomon, and he was talking to a local group about doing a monument in downtown Helena. And he was going to help fund it. And it's a clock tower type of monument. And we were very excited about doing something down in the park, 2 blocks or a block from here, because it would bring people downtown. And he said his only requirement was for him to fund it, or to help fund it, is that we put up the names of everybody who lost their lives in Elaine. Now, I'm thinking, here David is. David has been in New York for the last 50 years, maybe? 40 years? He's been away from Phillips County, born and raised here, but he's been away for many, many years. But his thought was, we have to do something to memorialize not only what happened, but all the people who lost their lives. Now, before I get to Sheila and Chester, Kyle started putting together this program. Once Father Brown has contacted him and they started putting it together, Kyle started doing his, the Delta Culture Center, I won't say Kyle. The Delta Culture Center started doing all of its media publications and everything. And there are people in this community, because I saw one of the emails, objecting to it. 98 years later, there are those who still don't want to come to terms with what happened. There are people who still don't want to talk about what happened. And then there's that other crowd that wants to be the gatekeeper of who gets to talk to whom. There are literally people in this county who say, if you don't come talk to me about this, you don't need to be talking. It really is like that. I saw the email. And it makes me wonder, where are we going? And I have to say this to put it all in context, is that today is just one program that's going to fit in a number of programs to bring light to this. We're coming towards the centennial of Elaine. It'll be in 2019. There are a lot of things we're trying to do to get this story out, to let everybody know what happened down in southern Phillips County that year. And so we'll be doing a number of these programs, or the Delta Cultural Center will, and a number of others. Let me say this, and I'll transition into our people. We have, speaking of people who come from different points of view, different backgrounds, different lives, but whose lives interconnected, or have now interconnected, because of what? Because of Elaine. If you think about what Warren Christopher said 20-something years ago, and the point being, 2 people whose lives interconnected or were impacted by each other, and they didn't even know it or didn't even think about it, it would be Chester and Sheila. What they're going to talk about is their family histories with Elaine and how they came together. And let me introduce them so they can do it, and so I can sit down and be quiet. Now, Sheila's from Hot Springs, and I'm going to dispense with formality. I should call her Miss Walker, Madam Walker. I should call Mr. Johnson, Dr. Johnson. I should give them all of their titles because of their wonderful lives and all the things they have done. But I'm going to dispense with formality because we're all family here, right? Are we? Or do I need to be called Judge? No, I'm Bryan, okay? I'm Bryan Miller. Okay, so let's do this. Now, Sheila was born in Hot Springs, and she grew up in Chicago and graduated from Loyola University. After college, she got married to her husband, who she's still with after all these years, and his name is Ivor, and they moved to New York. And Sheila worked in New York City for a number of years, and she was a member of the Army Reserve. She worked as a federal law enforcement officer in New York City, and at some point she decided she was going to leave the city, and I think you were in Brooklyn, right? We're in the Bronx. I guess I need to get that right. She was in the Bronx, and she and Ivor decided to move out of the city, so they moved up to Syracuse, where she lived for 26 years. And from what I remember, Sheila, after dealing with Syracuse in those cold winters and those nasty winters, at some point you decided, I've got to get out of here. And so she moved to a very warm climate. She moved to Delaware. I guess anything compared to Syracuse is warm, isn't it? Sheila has lived a wonderfully full life, and she'll tell us about it. One of the things she said when she sent over her bio, she says, I've lived such a wonderful life, but on paper it looks like I've lived a quiet life. Well, Sheila's going to get a chance to bring her life to life here in a second. And she and I were still married after all these years, and they have 2 wonderful children. I've met her daughter, who's an activist and very strong, and she has a son, and she has 3 grandchildren. We also today are going to hear from Chester Johnson. Chester was born in Chattanooga, Tennessee, raised in Monticello, or he spent a lot of his youth in Monticello. He graduated from the University of Arkansas and from Harvard University. He left, when he graduated from Harvard, he started his own financial advisory firm, and at some point became the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Treasury in the Carter administration. Chester, in addition to a life of finance, and in fact, I look at Chester's life as being somewhat of a Renaissance man. He is a king of finance, a well-educated man, but he also writes poetry and has written a lot of poetry. He is an essayist. He is a translator. He's authored numerous volumes of poetry, including the St. Paul's Chapel and selected shorter poems, which serves as the memento card used by the chapel that survived the 9/11 terrorist attacks at Ground Zero. In addition to a number of poetic and religious writings, Chester has written extensively on the civil rights movement and authored the Litany of Offense and Apology in Poetry and Prose for the National Day of Repentance. Now, I have really cut Chester's bio short because if you look at it, he's done some magnificent things, especially with his poetry. Chester is married to Frida Stern Johnson, and they have 2 children. Now we will hear from Sheila, who will tell us her story and tell us how she is connected to the Elaine Massacre.
Good afternoon. I'm glad that you all are having me here. It's just an honor. As you know, my name is Sheila Walker, and I was born in Hot Springs, Arkansas. I spent the first 6 years of my life in Hot Springs, and I grew up in Chicago. But Chicago was different. As a 6-year-old in Hot Springs, those first 6 years, I had no idea what racism was, none whatsoever. And that was soon to be different. I learned about racism in Chicago. Emmett Till was my first brush with racism, or hearing about racism, trying to figure it out. And I was only 7 years old in 1955 to understand that something happened to someone that looked like me just based on skin color. And then my next personal experience was the Little Rock Nine, 57? And on, as I'm in Chicago, I started to notice things that every school that I went to, all my teachers were white, and all the students were black. And so now, while in 57 you're integrating the schools here in Little Rock, Chicago was basically segregated as far as schools are concerned. There may have been a person here or there, but not many. The schools in Chicago, when I grew up, were segregated until we moved to the South Side, and then I moved to an area that was very near. I lived right across the street from the University of Chicago Law School, and just living there and being exposed to the things that the university had to offer. I was in this program that the university offered for underprivileged children that lived in Woodlawn, which is the area that bordered the University of Chicago, which was in Hyde Park. That's where President Obama has his home, in Hyde Park. So he wasn't even around then. But anyway, I had my first black teacher was in the 8th grade. So I learned about this racism in Chicago. I learned about what racism was. I was active in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, and because I was so young, I wasn't able to go to Mississippi for the Freedom Riders, but I did do my share of picketing and boycotting and walking sit-ins and demonstrations in Chicago. Now let's get to Elaine. When I was a child, maybe about 3 years old or so, I could have been younger than that earlier, but I overheard conversations between my great-grandmother and my grandmother. This is my great-grandmother, Sally Giles, and my grandmother, Annie Giles. I heard conversations with them conversing about a relative of mine going to jail and being sentenced to the electric chair. That was an interesting word for a child of 3.5, maybe 4 years old. So you just file those things back, but here I am listening. I'm sitting in the periphery of adult conversation, but I'm listening. I always tell people, watch what you say around children. They're listening. They are listening. So, in 1973, now I've gotten married, and we took a trip from the Bronx to Hot Springs to visit my grandmother. She was still living in Hot Springs. And she started to tell me a story about something that happened when she was a girl. She said she was 15. And she starts with this story that I knew something was going to happen. I knew that there was going to be trouble. And all of a sudden, we're at the meeting, and shots are fired. I see people getting hit and people dying in front of me. I gathered up the children that was in the church, and we got out. They escaped through a window, I guess, and ran into the woods. And then you say, well, what else happened? And then she goes into complete hysterics, it's an overstimulation of, or re-stimulation of something tragic that happened to her. And I never get that story. Each and every time I would get to that point and never get the story. And it was until after she died that I asked my mother, well, what is she talking about? What is Mama? This is what I call my grandmother, because my great-grandmother, we called her grandmother, and my grandmother we called Mama, and my mother who lived in that household, I called her by her first name. That's the way it was. But anyway, no disrespect to my mother. So when I asked my mother, she said, oh, she must be speaking about Elaine. So I say, Elaine? Yeah, like the name? Elaine, like the name? She says, yeah, the Elaine. So we had just gotten a computer. This is like 1998, 97, 98, something like that. I look it up on the computer, do a search, and what do I find are the newspaper accounts, the white newspaper accounts on Elaine, even as far as the Chicago Defender, the New York Times. They're writing about what happened in Elaine in 1919 while it's happening, that it's happening. And I'm reading this narrative. And as I go through the days of, because just the first day wasn't enough, I go to the second day, and I go to the third day, they've arrested people, and then I go to either that third day or something, but there's a name that comes out at me, and it's my uncle's name. The last name, I don't know the first name, Milligan. It's like, who is this Milligan? Giles. I call my mother. Milligan is your Uncle Jim, which I thought was James, but it's Uncle Jim. And so I look, and he's like one of the first that gives testimony that yes, there was indeed a conspiracy, and they were going to kill the planters, et cetera, et cetera. So I was like, that's kind of embarrassing news to look at and see. So I just kind of left it alone. But periodically I would go back and look up Elaine again. And it just so happens, it was probably in 2000, I see that there was some kind of talk amongst the people, white and black in Elaine, or something that, based on Griff Stockley's book, Blood in Their Eyes. And I see that, and I said, oh, well, I have to get that book and see what that book is about. I get the book, I read the book, and I was like, oh my goodness, this is something. I put that aside, I think about it, and says, whoa, boy. And I see the names in the index. I look up at the index, and I'm looking for the Giles name, and I see Albert, and I find out that my Uncle Albert, who I didn't know, was one of the Arkansas 12. And I'm reading, and the way Griff Stockley writes the book, he writes, it's from a viewpoint of a lawyer. So it's factual, it's boom, 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 boom. It's not what you would call a free-flowing read, but it's got a lot of information. So I kind of leave that alone. And a friend of ours, Barbara Love, who I met through my daughter, tells my daughter that there's a book written about Elaine and what was my grandmother's name. And my daughter calls me, and I says, well, Annie, but I don't think she would be, I don't know. But she says, well, what's your grandmother, your great-grandmother? I says, Sally Giles. And she says, I guess she must have talked to Barbara. She says, she's mentioned on the very first page of Robert Whitaker's book on the lapse of gods. So I get that book and I read it. Now, that book is written by a journalist. And not to take away from Griff, I think they both did outstanding research on this book, but it flows, as far as reading, a lot easier to read. It flows because he's a journalist writing something about history. And he's written for the Boston Globe. He was working at the time with the Boston. So he's writing, he's a journalist. His degrees are in journalism, and it was investigative journalism, what his degrees are in. So he knows how to look and investigate things. So comes up with the same facts, but it's easier to read. And in 2014, I heard, or something happened. My youngest sister died. She happened to be addicted to drugs, cocaine and heroin, and although she died from liver cancer. And I had already lost my eldest sister to virtually the same thing, the drug addiction. And I looked back, and I had just read Isabel Wilkinson's book, The Warmth of Other Suns. If you haven't read it, it's about the great migration from people of the South, black people, migrating to the North. And on that same table was that book. I just read it. It was late at night, and I'm reflecting about my sister, her death, and my family, and being raised poor. I was raised poor in Chicago, very poor. And living in poverty, and we're still, I was, at that time, when I'm reading this, I'm not in poverty, but I've always considered my husband and I as being working class, not middle class, but working class. We've always had to work. And 2 or 3 paychecks, we could be in trouble if we didn't. We had a little savings, but still, there are things that can happen, catastrophic things that can happen, that can cause you to just deplete all your savings and everything. So anyway, I'm looking at this and I was like, wow, we've never ever had a real good footing. Maybe, if that hadn't happened or whatever, my family would be better situated. Maybe they could have gotten money from those crops and maybe been able to buy a small farm and, make something of that. But anyway, I was looking at that just as a reflection. And so something called to me to email, to try to find Robert Whitaker's email address, which I did. And I got in touch with him, and I titled the email, I am a descendant of Sally Giles. And within 12 hours, he got back in touch with me and says, wow, you're the first African-American descendant of someone that was directly involved with Elaine, other than a judge I know in Arkansas, or that he know of in Arkansas, a federal judge. And he also knew of Chester, and he asked me when I did meet him, would I like to meet someone on the other side of the Elaine Massacre? And I says, yeah, why not? not knowing what to expect, not knowing how I would receive Chester, but I was open to it. I was open. So, he introduces Chester and I through an email. We get in touch with each other, or Chester calls me on the phone, and I'm on my way back from Virginia. I'm in the car traveling, so I'm on my cell. And Chester and I have a conversation that's well over an hour, hour and a half. I haven't laid eyes on this man. And from the conversation, I'm listening to a white male with a Southern accent. But there's a connection. We have connected for some reason. We connected over the phone without ever sight unseen to each other. And we had a great talk. And then we arranged, because my son lives in Boston, and we periodically would go to Boston. And so Chester says, I want to meet you. And so I'll make a train trip up to Boston, because I live in New York, and we'll meet. And Bob Whitaker kind of arranged that, so he was there with our meeting. He picked Chester up from the train station and brought him to my son's house. I was very anxious upon that meeting, very anxious, and sitting at the window and looking out and waiting for them to come walking up the street. And when we got into the foyer of my son's home, I could do nothing but embrace Chester. And when we sat down on the sofa, I don't know how or when or why it happened, but either I reached out or Chester reached out, but next thing I know, we're holding hands. And you want to talk about people being real? You know when people are real. I've been in law enforcement, so I can look and kind of make a judgment about when someone is being honest and totally open with me. And that's what I got from Chester. A mere stranger, but no, we're not strangers, because something brought us together. And when I look back and reflect on that, I look at the intervention, the divine intervention that has played the role of putting Chester and I together, and then Bryan. I met Bryan the following year together, because we're all a part of this story. We all are descendants of people. His people were murdered. Mine were sentenced to jail, and one was sentenced to the electric chair. My Uncle Albert, he was, like I said, the Arkansas 12, but he was part of the Ware 6. And as you know, that the Moore 6 went to the Supreme Court, and a decision was made on due process regarding to that. But I knew upon that first meeting with Chester that I had an ally. And I didn't know where it was going to lead me or what. But Chester and I are communicating, and he comes up with a symposium. I guess he introduced it to the church, his church, Episcopal Church in New York. It's called it's called Trinity Episcopal, and we had a symposium pretty much like this, but it's to all Northerners. It's not people like, this is a community that this terrible thing happened to, and it was just different. And so I'm so honored to be here to speak to people of this community, because it's very important, that you come here. And if you're white and you're coming here, you're interested in hearing and maybe even changing narrative you've been told and you've lived with all your life. And you're ready to be open to reconciliation. And meeting with Chester was like split as far as his feelings for his grandfather and reconciling his love and reconciling what his grandfather had participated in, what his grandfather had done. And so I kind of, at that first meeting with Chester, kind of said, it isn't for me to hold on to something terrible that happened. Because upon reading that book and reading the facts and knowing the facts, after reading it, knowing the history of this country, very much in the history of this country, knowing what happened during the Jim Crow era, very aware of it, knowing what happened during slavery, knowing what happened to my people in this country. And I don't know about you all, but as black people, we're a very forgiving people. And so that whole thing, all I could see was Chester's humanness. He was a human being like me. He was troubled. This is something that happened to both of our families, and something brought us together. I call it God. I call it divine intervention, because as things have gone, as I have been on this path and this journey, things have just fell into place as far as our connection is concerned. Our connection. What happened to Albert and Milligan? Well, my Uncle Albert, I guess, if you live in an abusive environment and there's either further abuse, you become an abusive person. And that he did become abusive. He married, he had a business, he had a younger wife, and he was abusive. And eventually the story is told. I always heard this story about an aunt. Her husband was so abusive and he beat her all the time that she mixed together some lye and poured it in his ear, and he died from that. So that's what happened to Albert. It wasn't a good outcome. But Milligan, on the other hand, my Uncle Jim, who was sentenced to 20 years at the Cummings farm prison, he didn't spend 20 years there. He was the most gentlest person that I ever knew as far as an uncle. My mother was an only child, so this was the only uncle that I knew. And as a small child, he was just wonderful, loving and caring. So I don't know how much Elaine affected him, but he still had that genuine humanness to show a child love. There wasn't any abuse. So the outcome was different with both of us. And so I asked myself, I don't know how far I am on time, how will a country built on freedom and slavery, on human equality and racial oppression, make good on its promise of liberty and justice for all? We must collectively continue to push forward to heal and make the unity and connection, to heal not only the land here, but heal our minds of this tragic event and learn to connect with each other. This is a community that needs to learn connection, white and black, Hispanic, whatever, to learn how to join collectively to heal from this tragic event. Whether your people were involved with it, if you're African heritage, you know your people were involved in some kind of way, unless you came over directly from Africa post civil rights movement, how your people have been affected by slavery and Jim Crow and so on. So this is a time, I think this year, especially this year, after everything, I don't want to get too political, but I think that especially after this year, this is a time for reflection and connection and trying to be better. I had a poem by Chester. I don't see it here. I guess it's gone. I left it last night that I wanted to read. But I had read it at the opening of the Turning Point Park in October, dedication in Elaine. Pat, who was here, and Brother Gibson, who's here, had invited me and my daughter-in-law down to speak on that occasion and that opening. So this is the second time that I'm speaking to this community. I'm glad that so many people turned out. White people, talk to your own white people about not only Elaine, but about just the general feel of racism in America. It's never going to end. We need, as black people, we need white people to help end it, and as white people, you need black people to help end racism. It's something that keeps us and drives us apart. And if you know the history of racism, you know that racism is basically, slavery was based on economics, just economics. And the justification of it was, that we were lesser than, et cetera, et cetera. But when it comes down to it, we're all human. We're all human. We're all born to be good. We're all born to be good. And it's when that the things that society brings in, whether it's through your parents, whether it's through just society, whether it's through just interacting with people with biases, that we take on different biases, and that's what keeps us apart. Those biases, we have to break down those biases, be willing to talk openly and truthfully, and by doing that, there comes a point of, if you are a descendant of someone that it happened to, if you are a descendant of someone who participated, it gives you a look at how to forgive that relative. Look at how to forgive them and how to carry on, and how we as a people, as human beings, can up the game for connection with our brothers, our fellow men. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheila, for that very moving personal testimony. Good afternoon. First, I want to mention that Sheila and I will be available tomorrow through Dr. Mill's office to meet with anyone who would like to follow up today's presentations and discussions. And we just hope that you'll come and visit with us. Secondly, on behalf of Sheila, we wish to thank the Delta Cultural Center and Dr. Kyle Miller for sponsoring this event, and of course, Federal Judge Bryan Miller for moderating our discussions a little later. Third, there are several images that will be included in my presentation that tell an important part of the Elaine story. So, Dr. Miller, I'm just going to briefly describe them. This is very briefly, this is a map of the major events that have occurred coming from up here, Uxborough Church, where the Union met. You follow that bridge further down, you'll see the first public road. That was the first killings of the morning following on October the 1st. You'll see the slough where actually that was the most significant outbreak of violence. Then the McCoy house where additional deaths occurred in the cornfields. But this, you can, and then in Elaine, you can see down at the bottom. But anyway, this is a map that was created as part of the Arkansas, Arkansas History Commission and the Butler Center. You want to switch the... this is the gathering of the groups from Mississippi, from Memphis, and from surrounding communities the afternoon of October the 1st. You can switch, go to the next. This is the beginning of the impoundment of the African American sharecroppers who were impounded both primarily in Elaine initially, and then later in Helena, and then obviously into the jail for a large number. Next, this is the Elaine 12 that Sheila was referring to. Next, Elaine 6, we're in the right-hand corner. That's Frank Moore, and the Hicks brothers are standing beside him. Over to the left here is Scipio Jones, the attorney. All others. You want to switch? We'll get back to this, but do we switch? This is Scipio Jones, a magnificent attorney, Little Rock attorney. On November the 21st, 1919, 74, African American prisoners who were found guilty in accelerated trials. Here, they were loaded on a train. 62 of them went to the Cummins prison farm. 12 went to Walls to be summarily executed. And through intervention, Scipio Jones not only did he save the lives of over a number of litigious and litigation phases, but within 5 years, and just bear in mind what was going on during that time, within 5 years, all 74 were free men. You can switch. This is Oliver Wendell Holmes, the case that Sheila made reference to, Moore versus Dempsey. It made its way all the way up to the Supreme Court, became a landmark decision that for the first time really gave teeth to the 14th Amendment of equal justice under the law. And the Associate Justice who wrote the majority opinion was Oliver Wendell Holmes. Switch. The last one I'll show. This is Lonnie, my grandfather, and then that was on my second birthday. My father died when I was 1, and my mother didn't do particularly well for a while, and so I ended up living with my grandparents, my maternal grandparents, until I went to the 1st grade. My mother brought my older brother and myself to. I actually talk about this. Sorry. Anyway, if you wouldn't mind just rotating and. So, from the before we have a few remarks before we go to the discussion. But can you hear me okay? Fine? All right. From 1st grade until college, I grew up in Monticello, Arkansas, only about 70 miles from Phillips County, if one is a bird. At that time, it seemed one couldn't get here from there. Monticello is the county seat for Drew County, the county in which Robert Hill resided, and where attorneys drew up the papers creating Hill's Progressive Farmers and Household Union, the Union of African American Sharecroppers. The Hoopspur Lodge, or chapter, of Hill's Union was meeting in Hoopspur Church north of Elaine late into the evening of September the 30th, 1919, when the first shooting began that turned into the Elaine Massacre. I lived with my maternal grandparents until about the time I started the first grade. My maternal grandfather, Lonnie Birch, worked his entire career for the Missouri Pacific Railroad, principally in McGee until near retirement, although he also was part owner of the Birch Farms in the northern part of DeShay County, immediately south of Phillips County. At the time of the Elaine Massacre, he lived in McGee. I adored Lonnie, and he adored me. We were inseparable until my mother settled with my older brother and me in Monticello. Lonnie joined the Elaine Massacre. During junior high and high school, I heard my mother, his daughter, tell from time to time how Lonnie had participated in a nearby to McGee, that is, well-known race riot, as she described it, where lots of people died, lots of people, with the killing in and by cotton fields and close to the railroad tracks. Now let's fast forward several decades. In 2008, I was asked by the National Episcopal Church to write the litany, the words for a national service, when the church formally apologized for its role in slavery and related evils. While involved in the writing, I learned for the very first time that the race riot of my mother's narrative and the Elaine Massacre were one and the same. Since discovering this fact, I've noticed that increased interest in the Elaine Massacre has occurred across the country recently. 5 years ago, I could Google, and did, the Elaine Massacre, and a page and a half would pop up. Today, there are pages upon pages. Information about this event is almost endless. Why does Elaine now appear on websites for churches and even in the pages of literary journals? There's not just one reason for this attention, but to focus on a slice for this public notice. The Equal Justice Initiative issues a report a couple of years ago showing, as part of its study, Elaine resulted in the most African American deaths for a racial attack within the South during the period from 1877 to 1950. The New York Times then writes a long piece on that report, highlighting Elaine. Later, the Los Angeles Times publishes an article on mass killings in the United States, and Elaine is featured. In 2014, Cambridge University Press publishes a book entitled Civil Rights and the Making of the Modern American State, in which Elaine and its related legal proceedings, Moore versus Dempsey, are the centerpiece of the book. The world has simply awakened to the Elaine Massacre, and I don't think the world's attention on it will somehow instantly decline, especially as we move closer to the centennial in the fall of 2019. But what does all this have to do with reconciliation? Sheila Walker just alluded to the underlying relevance in a personal way. For so many of us, Elaine is part of our own individual histories. Of course, on the face of it, neither Sheila nor I was involved in the event. And yet, in a larger sense, we are creatures of history, of near history more so than far history. In its own way, we know conclusively Elaine helped to shape us. Though I didn't fight in it, World War II helped to shape me too, and you as well. History does that. Even if no one had said a word about the Elaine Massacre, it still brought with it a persuasive, certain way of seeing things, a way of acknowledging the world in which we were born and matured. The fact that the particulars of Elaine were relevant this way, but closed, declares with an almost deafening roar the importance that Elaine holds for us, for people like Sheila and me, and for many of the folks who are here today. From Sheila and me, you hear that we believe reconciliation to be an outgrowth of an acknowledgement and a common acceptance of certain facts about the Elaine Massacre. You hear we wish to achieve a common understanding about crucial aspects surrounding the event in order for us to discuss with honesty, perception, and empathy the roles that our forebears played in this moment of history. At the risk of raising issues that potentially can separate us, though it is my intent to do exactly the opposite, I suggest that there are several key facts upon which all of us should be able to agree for a common understanding on which to build. I come to these facts based on considerable analysis in recent years about the Elaine Massacre and its aftermath. There is indeed much about Elaine which we can together acknowledge with common acceptance. 5 whites were killed, while there is a possibility that 2 of the 5 may have actually died by friendly fire. It is unclear how many African American deaths can be attributed to those groups of white men who came here from Memphis and Mississippi and surrounding communities. It is certain that the environment of the time, fear of unionization, and issues economic and racial that arose following World War I stoked the flames of the conflict here. What we don't know, and this matter has led to misunderstandings for years, is the number of African Americans who died. There is one narrative that argues 15 to 25 blacks died that first day from the various posses operating mostly in the area north of Elaine. This narrative further suggests that those deaths are the only ones inflicted upon African Americans during the conflict. Under this scenario, the federal troops came to restore order, and that's all the troops did, restore order orderly. However, the pertinent and reliable information does not end there. Based on military records and further supported through investigations and interviews with the federal troops by the FBI, at least 50 to 80 blacks were killed during the Elaine Massacre at the hands of the military. According to the McElvin report submitted to the Justice Department by the FBI within days of the conclusion of the Elaine Massacre, at least 20 were killed for refusing to halt when so ordered for resisting arrest. In addition, the FBI report concludes that the other African American deaths by the military came from an advance through woods where 150 sharecroppers were hiding, the federal troops clearing the area with machine guns and being under shoot-to-kill orders. So, at least 50 to 80 African American deaths by the military. And of course, there were other deaths, such as Dr. Johnston, the black dentist, and his 3 brothers, and similar ad hoc killings that occurred away from the first day and the military. There were also the marauding outside groups from surrounding communities in Memphis and Mississippi. Thus, the total would be in excess of 100. For a 2012 article on Elaine, I quoted Robert Whitaker, author of On the Laps of Gods, the story of the Elaine Massacre, who stated specifically for my piece, quote, "It is the documentation for the killing by the military, which I write about in On the Laps of Gods, that is the best evidence in my opinion, that the total number killed was above 100, close quote. The Encyclopedia of Arkansas History and Culture concludes that the African Americans who died in the Elaine Massacre could be in the hundreds. Also, a security agent for the Missouri Pacific Railroad who was deeply involved during the massacre and the trials following asserted in an affidavit that he personally saw 200 to 300 dead African Americans. I hope that as a result of our going through this data, we can help put to rest the narrative that the only African Americans who died during Elaine were those killed on that first day before the federal troops arrived. As mentioned earlier, the first step toward reconciliation is, in my opinion, a common acknowledgement of the most important facts surrounding the event. In this instance, the most immediate and obvious focus for reconciliation is that of race. Though economic factors were also present, the massacre occurred in the context of race. I don't think we need to debate that conclusion. Sheila has described well the affirmative, personal impact of reconciliation. By pursuing reconciliation, one is not simply accepting the most accurate and well-recognized facts of the particular important moment of history. One is equally accepting the proposition that each generation must determine on its own what is genuinely human, not bound by those who come before, nor limited by what we presume for those who come after, but that we alone determine that which is genuinely human. That is our grace. It has become a declaration that Sheila and I chose reconciliation over the alternative that is faded by silence and often faded by past untruths. Yet race is not the only area that cries out for reconciliation. While it is not so obvious, generational reconciliation also has its special place. At the beginning of my personal journey to and through the Elaine Massacre, I thought I could find that moment, that location where I would understand how Lonnie could be such a loving grandfather, maybe the most present person in my early life, and then participate in Elaine. Maybe that moment or location could be found in those rows and along the public dirt roads I have walked among the killing fields north of Elaine. But I admit I never found that moment or location. Lonnie has become a split figure, a bifurcated figure for me. Both sides explain him, I suppose, but I can't take them as representative of a blended person. Rather, he is simply both to me. One will undoubtedly find many surprises along this generational exploration. A partial denial by me of Lonnie's role surfaced when I wrote the article, as I applied the conditional word likely to his possible participation in the Elaine Massacre, though the information tied him directly to the event. In other words, likely, which softened the vision I had of Lonnie and Elaine, became my own form of subtle denial. At the same time, someone quoted Sheila in an article about the reconciliation between her and me as saying, quote, "I didn't know Chester's grandfather, of course, but I'm more forgiving of Lonnie than even Chester. People aren't bad. Circumstances make people do bad things." Close quote. It is a lesson one can learn from Elaine, that reconciliation shall also include acceptance of the view that circumstances make people do bad things. So to put it mildly, reconciliation with the past is a complex matter for us. and yet it can guide us to a more illuminated history and a more promising future.
All right, we're going to open it up to questions here in a second, but what I would like to tell you to do, when you ask your question, please come to the microphone. There's a microphone over there, but I'd rather you come to this one so we can get you on camera, and we're taping and filming all of this. I want to start this off by asking a couple of questions, though. I sat on a board with Mary Louise Desmarais Fizes some years ago, who was a wonderful woman who lived in Elaine. Her father had been the king of Elaine, so to speak, and her husband at the time was the mayor of Elaine. And whenever anybody would ever talk about Elaine, she would close up a little bit about it. She didn't really want to talk about it. And there are two sides to this. One side was she would always say, well, that didn't happen in Elaine. It happened in Hoop Spur, so leave us out of it. So it's commonly called the Elaine Massacre, but it's really the South Phillips County Massacre, so to speak. So there are people in Elaine who get very touchy about it. But the next part of it is, and I want both of you to touch on this, I've talked to many people, including her, who say, 100 years later, and at that time it was probably 85, 90 years later, why are we still digging this up? What can you accomplish by going back and trying to figure out the motives and everything else of those people? Can't we just get beyond it? And so I open that up to both of you. What is it that you're trying to accomplish or that you'd like to accomplish through these talks? And explain to us why this is so important, why we can't just get beyond it without this type of conversation. I guess Sheila, we'll ask you first.
Well, first of all, I think Elaine is like a wound that is festered and scabbed over. And if you pick at that wound a little bit, you can open it and release that scab. Take that scab. And if you apply something on it, it may heal. And in this community, it's the truth. That scab may heal when people start to recognize the truth, start to move on and say, well, how can we move forward? How can we do better than our forefathers? How can we move forward, move this community forward? And I feel the only way that you can do that is openly have a conversation, an open conversation about race. Kind of take your biases and put them by the door. Black people not being, how would you say, re-stimulated, but white people not starting to feel guilty, and that guilt causes you to point fingers, to try to go back to that old narrative. The reasons why this happened is such and such and such. It isn't the reason why it's happened. It's moving forward. It did happen. We can't change this. It's moving forward from what happened to knit together a community. And knitting together a small community can have its effect on a larger community. This is something that just doesn't affect Elaine. It affects all of America. All of America to sit down and be frank and open. If you feel that you're an ally to black people, sometimes our biases will get in the way of doing or speaking up or speaking out about things that we see that are wrong. So this is just a way of starting that conversation to move on, to do better, to do greater things.
Well, I guess I would start out from a personal point of view. I wouldn't necessarily come here and try to lecture people. But it was a personal, the desire to seek reconciliation started at a level of my own desire to reach out and to discover those who have a historical lineage that I have as a result of Lonnie's participation. And Robert Whitaker, who wrote On the Lapse of Gods, had recommended that Sheila and I get together and begin to have that kind of dialogue. So my first outgrowth in terms of toward reconciliation was not a large one. It was a very selfish and personal one. But I think any of us who have sort of looked at history would recognize that you don't really get over a traumatic experience unless you face, as a group, as a community, what are the basic facts about that event. There's a tendency, if a community doesn't address, and we've seen countries do this, they don't address what went wrong in their country, then they have an enormous negative self-image. It causes reduction in creativity, reduction in development, in energy, because, what was wrong with us? Why did this event happen here? Why, is there something wrong with us? Is there something wrong with the other, the other side? And there is this negative image that begins to compound itself, and it affects everyone's point. And I can give all kinds of ways in which people have used truth and reconciliation, but they use the word truth and reconciliation in various countries in the world that have dealt with this. But the personality, the identifications, the self-identification is pervasive wherever this happens, if one doesn't go through the exercise of truth and reconciliation. So, yes, it's been 100 years. And yes, I think the issue that Sheila raises about a scab and it not being healed, that's the way that I don't think you ever eventually get away from the time that this has an effect. If there is an absence of agreement on some fundamental facts about an event, it continues to bury and continues to give definition to the personality of the community that has to deal on a regular basis with the memory of what happened at that location.
Let me follow up with two questions, and then we will start taking questions. And the first one, and these are going to be somewhat blunt questions, so I want you to be ready for them. I've heard conversations from people who say, there's been this talk about having a conversation on race nationally. And I've heard people who oppose it say, well, no, really, the social justice warriors do not want a conversation on race. What they want to do is come and tell white people how bad you are and what you need to do to help me to solve my problem. And I've heard that conversation. And Sheila, I think you have laid this out. There doesn't seem to be any of that in what you're saying to us. But how would you respond to the person who says that you're hanging on to this, you're going around giving these speeches, because really what it is you want is you just want to keep telling white people how bad they are and what they need to do to help you out? Answer that.
That's a good question. I go on the basis that everybody that's ever put on this earth is born as a good person. So rather than focus on how white people have, how would you say, the injustices that we've undergone as black people in this country, rather than focus on that, focus on changing the perspective of white people of us. And I don't have to go out to try to prove who I am to you, because I am black, but change the perspective of how they think of me as a human being. Change their perspective to look into their own biases, their own things that they've been taught, and not things that openly make them human. That connection that I connect with you, I can 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 connect with every white person in this room. And we can connect on that level of being human beings with respect for each other, listening to each other's point of view, and in some way, just having that conversation, it may just make someone who is in disagreement look at that, take it apart, and maybe change their perspective.
And let me follow up with just the same type of question. There will be some who will say, okay, your grandfather participated, you did not participate, you are not guilty in any way, because you cannot be held accountable for what your ancestor or what your grandfather did. And there would be some who would say that there's a certain amount of misplaced white guilt that you're trying to overcome. And how would you answer that? In Sheila's circumstance, when I threw it out that the social justice warriors and they're demanding something, nothing in what Sheila says. I mean, Sheila's been very successful in her life. She graduated from college, was a federal law enforcement officer, Army National Guard, has done really well in life. You've done the same thing. And so I don't think her situation really fits the narrative of somebody who's trying to demand anything. But somebody could actually accuse you of having some amount of guilt that's misplaced. And how would you answer that?
I don't think that I started this journey to Elaine on the basis of white guilt. I think the journey began in my trying to determine for myself, how do I reconcile this wonderful person that I knew, who was my grandfather, who took me in and I adored, and I know he adored me, and reconcile that to his participation in the Elaine Massacre. Because here it is, my mother tells me periodically about this event that he participated in, and that I learned eventually was the Elaine Race Massacre. There's a certain level of, and I tried to make this comment in my presentation, there's a certain definition of who I am, Chester Johnson, that draws from the enormous influence that he had on me when I was very young. And I think it's more of a personal revelation, and the pursuit of personal revelation from more than a sense of white guilt. Of course, we know that slavery, started 400 years ago in this country, and there is a certain level of guilt that white folks do carry, but that's not, speaking personally, that wasn't the motivating factor for me. It was to try to determine where can I find lying? And I couldn't find him. I mean, he ended up being two separate people. But lying was the one who was driving me initially. But then it became, how am I defined, or am I defined, in part by the personality traits that I understand that he represented, and that undoubtedly was communicated in subtle and not so subtle ways in the family environment in which I was brought up, and not just when I lived with him, but in later years, because I do know that he was a member of the Ku Klux Klan, and there was a lot of racism in my family. So it was meant to be a self-revelatory exercise on my.
Last question from the moderator. Well, if you have questions, come on down. If you have questions, come on down. Come on down.
Hello, my name is Jaden Woods, and I have 3 questions. Why did the Elaine Massacre have to happen? Could it have been prevented? And how can we stop this from ever happening again?
You know, I'm a history buff, and I firmly believe that history has a way of repeating itself. Now more than ever, American history is changing. And I'm not going to say it's changing for the good, because something has, especially with this last election, has been, as someone says, the veneer has been removed from the furniture. We got the raw furniture now. So now is the time for us to look at things like Elaine, things that have happened in America, things that are keeping us still separate. Those people that are interested in saying, let us keep our democracy where it should be. Let us keep our country growing and becoming better. Let us do that. But the only way we're going to do that is not by separating. It's by coming together, and coming together not in a way of pointing fingers at groups, at groups of people, at immigrants, at LGBTQ, at black people, at Jewish people, at Muslims. We've got to come together, because this is what this country was made up of. It's nothing but immigrants. I think everyone white came here to some degree to escape some type of oppression or persecution, or to better their lives. Those of us who our forefathers were brought over on slave ships, our role now is to make something better of our lives. And it's not going to happen with us continually staying apart, continually fighting amongst ourselves, continually separating. We've got to come together as people in this country in order for democracy to survive. Otherwise, it's just not going to survive. It's not going to survive with the splinter groups that are now coming forth that we have. And I think that's why you have so many people coming, going into the streets, demonstrating about different things that are going on now in this country.
I really don't have anything to add to Sheila's response to that. I agree with her, and I don't have anything to add.
Anyone else have a question? Come down. Let's start lining up.
Oh my goodness.
Come on, white people.
Okay, all right. It's so hard to see them. My name is Deborah Hester, and I'm here, born here, raised pretty much here, been gone for about 40 years. I'm back here in the Memphis area, and I'm glad you guys stood up because now I can see you. And I really want to thank you for having the courage and to share this story and your story. I came today because of a couple of things. One, 1919, my mom was born in June 1919 here in Helena, and she passed away, and it's inspired me to come back here to try to understand a lot of things, right, and especially my heritage. And the second thing is that I also heard on PBS that this was the Red Summer, 1919. And what I think is significant about that is that it was not just here. So quite often we look at things locally, but I've grown because I've lived nationally and internationally and know things that are connected globally. So I always think locally and globally. So when I realized that it was just not Elaine, because I'd heard about Elaine. I'm sure everybody who ever grew up in this community has heard about the Elaine Massacre. Sort of don't want to talk about it, maybe do. I'm glad that we are. But my question is, if this was something that was in 1919, it was really not slavery connected. When I heard the information around the Red Summer, it gave me the impression that it had something to do with the Great War, World War I, and the impact that African American soldiers had coming back from World War I. So my question to you in all your studies, because I mean I've just found out about this in the last 30 days, so I haven't done my own due diligence, right? But not just about race is a conversation that personally I'm seeking to find out. I'm trying to understand root cause. So was this about economics? You sort of alluded to it earlier when you talked about slavery. Or was it about fear or hatred?
Let me respond to that. Let me just mention that there were two elements of James Weldon Johnson applying the term Red Summer 1919, this being the Red Summer. There were two elements of it. One being the obvious of, because there were race riots all across this country. There were journalists at that time calling what was going on in this country a war between the races. It was both domestic and foreign journalists were referring to what was going on as a race war. I mean, there were battles between races from Arizona all the way up to New England. And there were several things going on at the same time. One was clearly that the soldiers, African American soldiers, had come back, or had come back from World War I. They had been respected in certain significant ways in Europe that they weren't here. And because they had fought for the United States, there was a level of expectation that life would change here in the United States, and particularly in the South. And there was a concerted effort for those expectations to be dashed. Then number two is, bear in mind, if you look at it historically, it was right after the Russian Revolution and the victory by the Bolsheviks and communism and the declared ambition of communism to take over the world, and red being representation of world-dominated communism. And the first example of that, our first step for a lot of white folks in this country, was the unionization that was going on. And particularly, so for Hill to establish what he did in the Progressive Farmers and Household Union was a step seen by a lot of folks of the unionization movement, which was a precursor to communism. So there were several elements of the redness of, in addition to the letting of the blood. So you had the confrontations. Well, the point I'm also missing out is a lot of the veterans who came back, they knew how to take care of themselves because they had gone through. So there was that fear that was going on as well. So, it had many elements to it. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think I'm glad that you're like Bryan. I guess I don't necessarily have a question to ask, but I think that vaccine is very important in understanding motives, right? And in our motives, that I hope that will never drive us to make those kind of actions illegal. Right? I mean, that's the great thing.
Okay.
Minimize. So thank you.
Yes, thank both of you for coming. My name is Carrie Bobo. I'm a lifelong proud resident of Helena, West Helena, Arkansas. My grandmother was Carrie Kirkendall, and she was born October the 20th, 1900. So this happened a few days shy of her 19th birthday. I've lived with this story all of my life. And Mr. Johnson, some of the things you said is what was told to me as a child. And one of the things I'm asking and wondering is that we learn from our mistakes. Why has this been such a secret? I've been here all the time. It was never taught in school. It was not taught to me in the black school. It was not taught to me in the white school. And then me, myself, I was afraid to discuss it with anybody. She sent me there, and she told me when I like to cry because she said, live long enough, baby. And today I hear her story coming forth and coming true. And some of the things that she actually told me was just sort of gruesome, but I grew up with that. And it's one of the things that I also grew up with because of those things that happened in those days, is that, for the first quarter of my life, I grew up with a terrible fear of white people. Terrible. I mean, shaking fear. But if we learn from our mistakes, how long will we keep hiding things? You can't improve things that you do not know about. You have to want to do better. But if we keep hiding them, how can we improve? How can we heal? How can you even begin to heal? And that is my question. Why for so long? This area here was blind to it. I'm 62 years old. I've never been taught it. I've read it. I've Googled it since that time. But towards being educated, I know about the War of Helena. I know about the Indians. I know all of that. But when it comes to this, zilch. And that's my question to you. Thank you, guys, for sharing your information.
Can I just make a point here as well? It's not well known in the United States. It's just over the recent years that things are coming out. And like I said, my discovery was like a slap in the face. It was like, how many instances or how many cases of things that have happened in this country that we are not even aware of? Our new African American Museum in Washington doesn't even have any mention of Elaine. And it should be there. You hear about Tulsa, but you don't hear about Elaine. You hear about the Black Wall Street in Tulsa, but you don't hear about Elaine. I guess because it was sharecroppers, but it's still something that happened here in America, and it's something that should not only be taught in it. I have this thing about American history. Our history has been, American history as a whole has been whitewashed. It has not, we brushed over things that we really should be talking about. And this is why our youth today are so confused, because they're not getting a true picture of America. America has a lot on its hands, blood on its hands. But the only way I think to even cleanse it is to just the truth. Let's have history books with what really happened in America and why. Slavery is based on economics. Economics. That's what it. There was a certain amount of racism beyond that. Underlying that, but it's economics that made slavery and that made Jim Crow so powerful in this country. It's exploitation of someone, exploitation, and we were exploited in slavery. We were oppressed during Jim Crow. And there's a lot in Jim Crow, in the Jim Crow era, we're not even privy to that what happened. Another point I wanted to make to somebody that asked the question, how can we not be repeated? In 1919, Woodrow Wilson was the president. Birth of a Nation had come out. So that even stirred up some of the white supremacy of that day. That stirred it up. And I feel it is being stirred up now in 2017. That same type of incitement of people and trying to divide people on race. It's all about economics, you know? It's all about economics.
First of all, I'd like to thank Mrs. Walker and Dr. Johnson. My name is Dr. Bryan Mitchell. I'm
sorry, but I'm not a doctor, but Bryan elevated me higher.
Oh, you gave your rank, huh? Well, it's always good to be bumped up, right? I wanted to thank both of you for coming out and sharing your narratives about your family. I'm working with the Arkansas Studies Institute, the Butler Center, and Mosaic Templars, and planning the 1919 commemoration of the massacre. And I'm trying to collect data, narratives, personal narratives, photographs, documents, and digitizing these and making sure that they're widely accessible to the public, particularly children and teachers who will be teaching in Arkansas. So I want to give a shout out or let the audience know that if you have anything, whether it be pictures, documents, funeral notices of Atkins or Pratt, or even Corporal Luther that were killed at the riot, please let me know, and I'm happy to come out and have somebody come out and collect those from you, make images of them, and give their originals back to you. You can find me if you go to Euler's, University of Arkansas Little Rock's history page. Just go to faculty. I'll be the only African American there, so it'll be pretty easy to find. There'll be a picture of me. Click on that picture; it'll lead to a hyperlink, and that hyperlink will populate your address on your mail. Feel free to send me an email if you just want to write your narrative down, if you want me to call you, if you want me to send someone out to you, an oral historian out to you, one of our graduate students out to you, I can. If you have pictures in there rather sensitive and you don't want your family's name attached to them, you just want to make sure that these pictures are recorded and kept in the archive, all you have to do is tell me that, and I'll make sure that they're added to the collection. Dr. Bryan Mitchell.
Bryan, while you're going through and doing this work, I'd like you to put just a parenthesis on, okay?
Yes, sir.
I hope there is a discussion group going on somewhere, sometime soon, that is an effort to put a biography together of Scipio Africanus Jones. It is the story that needs to be told, that hasn't been told. He is a genuine American hero, and we ought to do it. And so in your work, please put that forth.
Just last week, I did a presentation for a number of lawyers inside of in the Little Rock area about Scipio Africanus Jones, and particularly his contribution that he made in regard to the Elaine cases that went on to the Supreme Court, the role that he played there, and his origin. A lot of people don't know that he started out as a slave. You know, he was born in slavery, the son of his master, so the illegitimate son of his master. And he makes his way through law school, working as a tenant farmer, which could be why he was so passionate about the defense of these tenant farmers. Thank you.
I just wanted to comment on that thing on Scipio Africanus Jones. As a person of the black community, I only discovered him through the books that I read. And I just feel that he should be known to every African American child in this country about what he contributed to African Americans for civil rights. And the civil rights movement wasn't happening then, and what he did was quite extraordinary. You know, just the fact that he even did the defense, and then the fact that he would have to hide every day or evening at someone's house because his life was in jeopardy for defending his own people. So he should be remembered and recalled. I'm just shocked in Arkansas that he's not this big hero that will walk or whatever. There's something in Little Rock with heroes. The trail, that he's not on that trail. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, yes. Good afternoon. Thank you for coming. My name is Davis Wilkins. I don't live in Helena now, but I was born and raised here. My father was a World War I vet. He died when I was 3. The name, reflection and reconciliation. Along with reconciliation should come some form of repentance. Have you heard anybody say anything about any forms of repentance, any repentance about what happened in this community? See, you were saying you probably didn't understand how your grandfather could be involved in this. Truthfully, your grandfather was an accomplice to murder. Can you accept that? Can this community accept that? That a lot of your white relatives here were accomplices to murder. Now, I don't dislike anybody, but that's just the real deal. We have to come to grips with what has happened in our community. In order for it to heal, we got to call a spade a spade. We can't just sit up and say, okay, this happened now. We want to look over it, and that it doesn't work like that. Life doesn't go like that. Like Carrie said, I was one of, she's 62, I'm 60. I was one of those kids that went to Central. I saw racism in this town. I was afraid I can tell you some things about this community. I'm going to say this. When these people went through what they went through, my feeling is it can be compared to post-traumatic stress disorder. Something that wasn't even named back then. These people went through something. They raised kids. They became adults that were messed up. Those adults raised kids that became adults that were messed up. Our community has been poisoned by murder. Are we going to just sit up and not say anything? Okay, we're going to let it go along, and we're going to say, well, okay, everything is fine now. We want our land to be healed, and we want business to come back because we talked about it. We really haven't talked about it. The hurt that's in people, that's deep down in some people that are great-grandchildren or grandchildren of these people, that hurt is still in there someplace. And you all hurt. White Phillips Countyans hurt also. This will do you some good too. And I think it's something that really has to be talked about. And what do you all have to say about that?
Next question.
I agree.
My name is Sandra Fisher, and I live in Pine Bluff, Arkansas. I thank you for being here. I was born in Port Gibson, Mississippi, and I moved to Los Angeles, California at the age of 3. My parents rarely watch films that depict the struggle of black people in the South, and I couldn't understand that until I moved to Pine Bluff 23 years ago. I've had more history lessons here than I ever had when I was in school, and it's real for me now. And when you're talking about the reflection and reconciliation, I was sitting there and I was like, boy, this is good information, and everyone in the United States needs to know about this. And then I got teary-eyed and didn't know where it was coming from until I realized I saw a commercial last week. There will be a documentary about the burning of Los Angeles, and it had to do with the aftermath of the Rodney King verdict. So the reason that we need to deal with all of these issues is because if we keep perpetuating a fear among the races, among the classes, we're going to continue to get what we've always gotten.
Hello, everyone. I currently live in Little Rock now, and I first heard of the Elaine Massacre last year right when my son was doing a physical therapy intern, and he met a woman that lived in Elaine, and she told him. And my question is, what are the relations between black and white now, not only in Elaine, and I understand it didn't happen exactly in Elaine, but Elaine got the name, I guess. But what is the true relationship now among black and white community members in the area in general? And secondly, quick statement, I think the only way that we can have true reconciliation, it is right if we all start those conversations in home, and then bringing, like, kind of like what you said, the white people talking to white people, and then us all coming together and having a true conversation without the animosity. But yeah, that's all.
Hello. My name is Dr. Steffi Turner. I'm a clinical psychologist. Excuse me? Hello? My name is Dr. Steffi Turner. I'm a clinical psychologist with a specialty in forensics and also an emphasis in being an activist and researching black history. So I learned about the Elaine Massacre when I was doing my dissertation on race in America, and I'm from Mariana. So I'm sorry I'm late, but sir, were you a part of it, your family, or of the situation? I didn't get it. I'm sorry. Am I doing something wrong?
Yeah, there you go. Just speaking.
Okay, I'll start over. My name is Dr. Steffi Turner. I'm a psychologist, clinical psychologist with a specialty in forensics, and also have an interest in racism. And how I learned about the Elaine Massacre, I found out when I wrote my dissertation about race in America. And also, I missed it. I apologize for being late, but are you a descendant of the people that participated in the massacre?
Well,
not people, but there was a person. My maternal grandfather participated in the massacre. He was in the employ of Missouri Pacific Railroad, which took a pretty significant role in the activities of the massacre as well as the aftermath.
The aftermath, okay. All right, and did your family profit financially in any kind of way from the massacre?
Interesting question. I don't. There would be two ways. You know, he kept his job with the Missouri Pacific Railroad, presumably, but more than that, they had a farm in northern Deshay County.
Okay.
So, but that farm has long since been.
But you did receive some type of profit. Your family did profit in some type of way. They did continue employment.
Pardon me?
They did continue their farm and their employment.
I really.
Oh, it had nothing to do with that.
I don't have it.
Okay, all right. And did your family talk to you about it? How did you find out about it?
No, only one. The way I found out about it was that my mother, when I was in junior high and high school, would occasionally mention, because in '57 was Central, and we used to spend time in Little Rock with visiting relatives, and the whole issue of race was headlines during that time. And so my mother would occasionally mention to me about her father participating in this event.
Okay.
But she didn't say this event. She said in a well-known race riot.
Okay.
And without identifying it. But she described the place, the topography of what happened, the railroad tracks, the cotton fields, etc. So when I learned more about Elaine, I made the connection, especially since, there had been lynchings in various places in southeast Arkansas as well, but there wasn't this consolidated, substantial loss of life anyplace else. So it had to, by virtue of the combination of the topography and the description of that, as well as this being well-known and large, it had to be Elaine.
Yes.
So, anyway.
Okay. All right. And thank you for that. And also the title, Reconciliation. Who thought of that title?
I don't know. We did.
I'm Kyle Miller. I'm the director of Delta Cultural Center. So that was actually the title that we came up with. And we realized this is not exhaustive. This is one talk of many that we're going to have over the course of the next couple of years. But I do believe that part of how reconciliation happens is actually through conversation.
Exactly.
So that's it.
So it's like a process of atonement.
It's the process of it. And
would you be having something?
Yes, we will continue. We will continue to have these types of things, and they'll be posted on our website. And one thing that I think that's kind of hit at a little bit as far as the economic aspect of it, but there was a deep economic aspect dealing with the massacre as well. And I didn't necessarily always understand that initially. I knew that my great uncles were murdered. They were the Johnsons that were murdered. However, I didn't realize that there was also an economic aspect to it as well. And actually, one of the 12 in an Ida B. Wells book, which some of you may not have read, but it's very informative. Yeah. She explains how one of the 12 owned land, and he was very prosperous. When he went to jail, his land was seized.
Okay. Yeah.
His wife went back to the house, and they were sitting on her porch saying, "This is our property now," and taking her furniture out and had seized her property and her land. So, so when you talk about that, there was a lot of financial gain as far as the massacre as well, because a lot of this land was seized from black landowners.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. Okay. All right. That's it. Yeah.
I work with the Lee Street Community Center, and my question may not be directly to you as much as it is to everybody involved. Well, I have two questions. One of them is, where is the funding to help us keep this going? Because we've learned that we know we can do things, but we haven't been able to do it. That's not my major question. My major question is for the young people who are here, and somebody may have the answer. Do we have an educational program that we are ready to get into the hands of teachers about this? I have been trying in Northwest Arkansas. I've been teaching about Scipio Jones, and I'm finding mixed reactions, and I do believe that teachers need some guidance before they jump into the classroom. So is that literature available quickly? Because 2019 is almost here.
We're gonna work on some of that. I'm sure Dr. Mitchell, I hope that we can exchange cards. But I know at Culture Center, we have an in-house education person along. We're looking at contracting with some curators as well to put together a curriculum that's going to coincide. And that's one of the reasons why we're doing this as well, because we do recognize that the memorial is coming very, very soon, and we need to have a full educational package to discuss this. So I appreciate you for mentioning that.
And I would be very willing and would like to participate, being from the school counselor and teacher's point of view, as to what we might do to present this in a way that makes progress and doesn't make us regress in our relationships.
Hello, my name is Candace Jones. I'm a teacher at Little Rock Central High School. Yeah, I'm a teacher at Little Rock Central High School. I teach 12th grade, and by the way, I do teach I have some of my students do presentations regarding the Red Summer in my English 12th grade class, so it's already being taught in some schools, in some classes. But my question, well, I actually have two questions, and I think one has kind of already been answered. The first one is, how often do you guys plan on doing this, like formally continuing this conversation? And the second one is based on the fact that you two are descendants, and then you are a descendant of the massacre as well. My question to you guys, all of you guys, is who, after you guys have passed on, who inherits your role of passing on this history, not just only in the classroom, but to your family? Like, is there who inherits that role in your family?
As soon as I got information about this, I gave it to my two children. So they got the books and they read about it, and they're pretty versed in what happened in Elaine. My daughter-in-law, who happens to be German, is also a film producer, and she and another film producer have made this a project to tell the stories about the descendants and Elaine. It's just not telling the story of Elaine, but the after effects, how we've come together, how Bryan, Chester, myself, and Kyle come together as families who are descendants and where our families stand. As far as I think my children will probably take it. Okay. My daughter is a music organizer. I'm almost certain.
Well, no, I had said this would be the last question, but I see we have two more people. No, we'll take it. Ms. Hammonds will be the last question. Yes, ma'am. No.
Well, my name is Barbara. I thank you for sharing your stories, for your efforts to educate all of us, to uncloud a bit of our history, to make it more available to all of us. And instead of a question, I have an experiment. My question is, can I do a little experiment? And this is my experiment. The point is reflection and reconciliation. And you have said that reconciliation follows dialogue, people getting a chance to talk. And one of the things that I notice is that not exactly true, but the white people are pretty much over here, and the black people are pretty much here, and the white people are pretty much over there, and we're just kind of separate from each other. So my proposal is that we could do a little getting together. So how many of you would be willing to talk to each other across this racial divide? Just raise your hand and I'll know whether I should sit down and shut up. Okay, I see. Excellent. And for those of you who want to do it, great, and those who don't, that's fine. But here's what I'd like you to do. I'd like for you to find somebody that you did not come with, a white person with a black person and a black person with a white person. So that means you're going to have to get up, and I'm sorry you might not be able to tape this so well. Walk across the aisle, find somebody, and then I'm going to give you a specific set of directions. Okay? So find a partner, and when you find your partner, then I'm going to tell you what to do next. So go find somebody that you're going to talk to. Find somebody you're going to talk to. Find somebody that you're going to talk to. And when you get your partner, go find somebody. Go find somebody. Go find somebody. Walk across the church. Walk across the aisle. Okay, now I need to give you some directions. Hello? 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 Now here are your directions. Decide on who is A and who is B, who is A and who is B. So right quick, decide who is A and who is B. Very quickly. All right, A's, raise your hand. A's, raise your hand. A's, raise your hand. Okay, B, raise your hand. Now listen, I need you to hear these instructions. Hear these instructions. Hello, stick with me. Stick with me, and okay, here are your instructions. Hello, this is a speak and listen. You get to talk while your partner listens, and then your partner gets to talk while you listen. All right? Your topic, are you with me? Can you listen to me? I want to give you instructions. Hello? 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 I want to give you the instructions, okay? When it is your turn to talk, the topic is, what are the feelings that come up for me when I hear about and think about Elaine?
I've got to bang the gavel on this. I got to bang the gavel. We've gone too far.
We've gone too far. Okay.
Let the courtroom come to order. You can be seated. Let the courtroom come to order. You can be seated. We have one last question, Ms. Phyllis. Look, we've gone long anyway.
Okay, I'm not going to be very short. She actually is a segue to what I wanted to say. I want to say that I'm Phyllis Hammers. I'm a lifelong resident of Helena. I returned back, and in 98 or the beginning of 2000, we had our first conference on the Elaine riot through the Delta Culture Center, and it ended up in almost a riot. But today I feel differently. But what I want to say now is this: the reconciliation started during the riot because Dr. E.C. Morris, who is the pastor of the historical Centennial Baptist Church, a National Historical Landmark, and the first president of the National Baptist Convention, was the liaison between the black and the white community. And so it started at that particular time. The white community came to Dr. Morris and said, can you help us stop your people from tearing up Helena. And Dr. Morris said it has to go both ways. And so he talked to his people, and he talked to the whites in the community, and the riot did not affect Helena. Dr. Morris was a very powerful gentleman. And as I indicated, he was the founding president of the National Baptist Convention that is still in existence today. The church that he built is just right down the street on York and Columbia. And the Miller family, the two doctors and the judge, are working with a group of us to restore it to its natural beauty. So the other thing I want to say to you is something that I have always wanted to happen in this community. You remember in South Africa when Bishop Desmond Tutu led the reconciliation meetings all across South Africa? We tried to do that here in Helena, and it stopped at some point. But I think we're not going to ever heal until we all, black and white, brown, get together and talk about how we both hurt. And that has to happen. We cannot move forward until that happens. So my challenge is that I'm hoping that under the leadership of Dr. Kyle Miller, who has done a tremendous job, and I think you should give him a hand. And I know under his leadership, with the power of the judge and others in the community, we can make it happen. Thank you.
And I don't think there's a better way we could have ended this afternoon. I will say, before we adjourn, I'd like to give a rousing round of applause to both Sheila Walker and Chester Johnson. Okay. And you are all invited to the reception immediately after this that will be in the back. Come on back and get to know each other and get to know everybody. And we will follow up on the exercise we were conducting just a second ago. I just needed to adjourn everything, okay? All right, we are adjourned.